During an address to the South African Parliament on February 3, 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan spoke of the wind of change sweeping over Africa. This was a reference to the coming decolonization of the African continent. Following the Second World War, the European powers were too financially exhausted to maintain their extensive empires. Through the 1960s and 70s, newly independent African countries came into being upon the departure of the Europeans. However, there were still white colonial stalwarts in southern Africa, namely the Portuguese colonies on the continent like Angola and Mozambique, the white minority government in Rhodesia, and apartheid-era South Africa. South Africa remained under white European control until the 1990s. Why did these states remain under European control for such a long time? What ultimately caused these regimes to fall? In this video, we're going to examine the fall of Southern Africa's white minority regimes. Portugal was one of the earliest European colonizers present in Africa. The Portuguese trading post of Elmina was built in 1482, the oldest surviving European structure in Africa. Portugal's colonies in Africa date back to the 15th and 16th centuries. That being said, European colonization of Africa did not begin in earnest until the late 1800s, when anti-malarial agents like quinine became more widespread. Let's take some time to talk about Portugal's economy and history. This is somewhat personal for me since I studied abroad in Portugal during undergrad. Portugal has one of the smallest economies in Europe and is also constrained by its small size and population. The weakness of the Portuguese economy would become a constraint during the Portuguese colonial wars of the 1960s and 70s. The wind of change that Harold Macmillan spoke of in 1960 had swept through the Portuguese colonies. In 1961, Portugal's defense budget was $93 million. For comparison, Britain's budget was $4.4 billion. France's budget was $3.3 billion. The US defense budget was a whopping $41 billion. Due to Portugal's small size, both geographically and population-wise, her military was relatively tiny compared to those of the US, France, and Britain. Author John P. Cann writes, "There were two key elements that underpinned Portugal's effort in this sphere. The first was to spread the burden of the war as widely as possible, and the second was to keep the tempo of the conflict low enough so that the expenditure of resources would remain affordable." In Angola, the Portuguese faced three main insurgent groups, the FNLA, the MPLA, and UNITA. The FNLA, or National Liberation Front of Angola in English, was made up of roughly 6,000 personnel and was based in the Belgian Congo. The FNLA, formerly the UPA, was founded by Holden Roberto. This group would eventually fade into obscurity, and many former FNLA fighters formed the nucleus of an elite South African light infantry unit called 3-2 Battalion, but more on that later. The MPLA, or Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, operated out of Congo-Brazzaville and later moved to Lusaka in Zambia. This movement had about 4,700 men under arms until 1974. An FNLA splinter group called UNITA, National Union for the Total Independence of Angola in English, was formed in 1966 under the leadership of Jonas Savimbi, though it was quite small with only 500 men. In Guinea-Bissau, the Portuguese were up against the PAIGC, founded by Amilcar Cabral. The PAIGC began fielding forces in 1962, which grew to the size of 5,000 regulars and 1,500 popular militia by 1973. In Mozambique, the Portuguese colonizers fought the Frelimo movement. By the early 1970s, Frelimo had 7,200 regulars under arms and 2,400 popular militia. Frelimo was founded by Eduardo Mondlane. Each of the Portuguese colonies represented a different operational environment for Portugal's forces. Angola, for instance, was quite vast, over 1.2 million square kilometers. To put that in perspective, French Indochina was nearly 751,000 square kilometers. The British, during the campaign in Malaya, had to cover an area of 333,000 square kilometers. In other words, the Portuguese had to cover more space with fewer troops. Guinea-Bissau was smaller in size. The west of the country was made up of mangroves and swamp forests. Meanwhile, the northern and eastern portions of the country are a savanna plain of grasslands. Thousands of miles of navigable river extend into Guinea-Bissau's interior. These rivers are hidden from the air by thick foliage and mangroves. Guinea-Bissau's elevation does not exceed 300 meters. Mozambique was a 1,000-kilometer-long coastal belt, and the northern portion of the country was a wide and open space that was sparsely populated. The Portuguese colonial wars, or the Ultramar War, kicked off in 1961 after a UPA incursion into Angola. During the first week of this armed incursion, 300 whites and 6,000 blacks were killed in UPA attacks. Going into the war, the Portuguese had not fired a shot in anger since World War I. The Portuguese armed forces were not structured for the kind of counterinsurgency they would be waging. However, they had the knowledge acquired by the French in Algeria and Indochina and the British experience in Malaya to draw upon. Due to the logistical and economic strains of recruiting and transporting personnel from the mother country, the Portuguese spread as much of the burden as possible to the colonies themselves. By the end of the war in 1974, local recruits from the colonies made up half of the force in Angola and Guinea-Bissau and 54% of the force in Mozambique. Let's talk about Operation Gordian Knot, the largest operation of the Ultramar War. This operation was to destroy Frelimo bases in northern Mozambique and cut off Frelimo infiltration routes from Tanzania. Operation Gordian Knot inflicted heavy casualties on Frelimo, however the Portuguese also sustained heavy casualties. Additionally, the decisive victory that the Portuguese High Command hoped for was not achieved by the end of the operation. The Portuguese colonial war dragged on until 1974, when the Estado Novo regime in Lisbon was overthrown by left-leaning military officers in the Carnation Revolution. In September 1974, Frelimo concluded an agreement with the new Portuguese government, securing Mozambique's independence. That same year, Portugal recognized the independence of Guinea-Bissau. In early 1975, the Alvor Agreement was signed, recognizing Angola's independence. Nearly 9,000 Portuguese soldiers lost their lives and over 15,000 had been wounded. On a personal note, I studied in Lisbon during undergrad and visited the military museum there. We actually discussed the fall of the Portuguese colonial empire in the class I was taking in Lisbon. Seeing the Tower of Discoveries and the military museum in Lisbon and crossing the April 25th bridge itself brought Portuguese history alive for me. If you've heard the name Rhodesia, you'll probably react in one of two ways, either with disgust toward the racially oppressive colonial system in place in Rhodesia, or with admiration for pale farm boys in short shorts wielding FNFALs. Let me talk very quickly about the early colonial history of what used to be Rhodesia. The British colonized Rhodesia, today Zimbabwe, in the late 1880s. The British South Africa Company was granted, and I use the term granted very loosely, mining and political concessions from Ndebele King Lobengula. In 1890, Fort Salisbury was established, later becoming the capital of Rhodesia. In 1923, Rhodesia was given responsible government status rather than uniting with South Africa. Interestingly, Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith wrote in his memoirs, "They voted with their hearts, not their heads. There were too many non-Britishers in South Africa, the Afrikaners, and Rhodesians were not prepared to accept such a change of national character." He went on to say, "It is easy to be wise through hindsight, but clearly Rhodesians made the wrong decision." Smith opined that a United Party victory in the 1948 South African elections would have been better for Rhodesia and South Africa. The victorious National Party curbed immigration, which the UP had supported, and thus restricted the growth of the white community in South Africa. About half of Rhodesia's white population in 1969 had arrived after World War II. Many of these new arrivals were British ex-servicemen and their families. During the World Wars, Rhodesia's white population contributed more men per capita than any other British colony. Rhodesian troops also saw service in Malaya alongside Commonwealth forces. As much as we might think of Rhodesians as a monolith of white and mostly British-derived frontiersmen whose roots date back to the 19th century, the true picture was quite different. Only 40% of the white population was actually Rhodesian-born. More than a fifth of the white Rhodesian population was born in South Africa. A slightly larger percentage of whites had been born in the United Kingdom. Over 30% of whites in Rhodesia were dual citizens or citizens of a foreign country. From 1961 to 1969, nearly 50,000 white immigrants arrived in Rhodesia and 92,000 had left. In the 1969 Rhodesian census, blacks outnumbered whites by 21 to 1. Add to that the fact that blacks had a higher fertility rate and were younger on average. Of course, we can't talk about Rhodesia without talking about its system of racial segregation. While Rhodesian-style segregation was less extreme than South African apartheid on paper, it was essentially the same in substance. Whites were allotted the best land and went to the best schools in Rhodesia, and their privileged status was codified into law. There were segregated public amenities, racial discrimination in the Rhodesian voting laws, and curfews imposed on Africans. However, there was a key problem that undermined Rhodesia's racist policies: the fact that Rhodesia literally could not afford segregation. White flight during the war years also undermined the white minority government's efforts to keep itself in power. Let me talk a little bit about the Rhodesian Bush War. The Rhodesian Bush War began in 1964 with the murder of a white farmer by Zanla forces on July 4th. The Rhodesian security forces were up against black nationalist organizations ZANU and ZAPU, more specifically with their armed wings, Zanla and Zipra respectively. ZANU was led by Robert Mugabe, who would go on to become independent Zimbabwe's first leader. ZANU was led by Joshua Nkomo. The African nationalist insurgents were not marching in lockstep with each other, and infighting took place between the two groups. Initially, the security forces were able to keep the insurgents in check. Between 1966 to 1968, the Rhodesians lost 13 troops but killed 150 and captured nearly 300. There were no guerrilla attacks in 1969, some minor skirmishes in 1970, and no incidents during 1971. The fact that Rhodesia was bordered by a friendly South Africa and the Portuguese colony of Mozambique helped the Rhodesians' cause. In December 1972, the Rhodesians had 4,700 regular Army and Air Force personnel at their disposal, augmented by 10,000 white territorials, 8,000 members of the British South Africa Police, 3/4 of whom were black Africans, and 35,000 police reservists, 3/4 of whom were white. The regular army consisted of two battalions, the All-European Rhodesian Light Infantry and the Rhodesian African Rifles, commanded by white officers. If you want to read an interesting account of a Rhodesian light infantryman during the Bush War, check out Chris Cox's book Fire Force. The security forces also fielded an artillery battery and a unit of engineers. There were also special operations units in the security forces like the Rhodesian SAS and the Selous Scouts later in the war. The Rhodesian Air Force played a secondary role in the war prior to 1972. They fielded 10 Canberra jet bombers, 11 de Havilland Vampires, 12 Hawker Hunters, and 12 T-52 Provost, totaling 45 planes. Rhodesia's Air Force also had 12 Alouette helicopters, and in 1970 it was actually larger and more modern than the South African Air Force. The security forces were also augmented by personnel from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the South African Police, which had been performing joint patrols with the Rhodesians. In 1975, the South African Police were withdrawn from Rhodesia. During the period of 1972 to 1973, Rhodesian defense expenditures totaled nearly $24 million. While Rhodesia's defense budget was even smaller than that of Portugal's, it must be mentioned that the security forces also had a smaller area of responsibility. After 1972, the Rhodesian Bush War began to escalate. Zanla and Zipra were receiving assistance and training from Eastern Bloc countries like the USSR, North Korea, and China. The Rhodesian regime attempted to present its struggle against the African nationalists as a struggle of Christian Western civilization against godless communist barbarism. International sanctions, the independence of the Portuguese African colonies, South Africa's willingness to support the transition to majority rule, and ongoing white flight all worked against the Rhodesians. By the mid-1970s, the Bush War had intensified. The military situation had regressed to the point where the Rhodesians were doing the equivalent of trying to put out a large fire with cups of cold water. Eventually, the white minority government acceded to black majority rule. More than 1,300 security forces personnel were killed, as well as 10,000 insurgents. ZANU leader Robert Mugabe would be elected prime minister in 1980. On April 18th of that year, Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. Less than 40,000 whites remain in Zimbabwe today, the vast majority of whites having already fled or been expelled by Mugabe's government. I won't delve too deeply into the history of South Africa before the 20th century since that is not our focus here, but I'll give you a quick rundown. The European presence in South Africa began in earnest with the arrival of Dutchman Jan van Riebeeck in 1652. Van Riebeeck established what became Cape Town. The Europeans who settled there were a mix of Dutch settlers, German mercenaries and sailors, and French Huguenots escaping persecution. These European settlers became known as Boers and later Afrikaners. Afrikaners make up more than half of the white population in South Africa today. The British later took control of what we call today South Africa. South Africa was a dominion of the British Empire, and the South Africans fought in both world wars alongside British forces. Going into the 1960s and 70s, South Africa's armed forces were modeled after the British military. South Africa hadn't fought in any major engagements since World War II, although a South African Air Force contingent had served in the Korean War. On August 26, 1966, a force of South African police officers and soldiers attacked a base in Namibia belonging to the Southwest Africa People's Organization, or SWAPO, signaling the start of the South African Border War. SWAPO began as the Ovamboland People's Organization in 1959, founded by Sam Nujoma. At this time, South Africa controlled Namibia and had been in control since World War I. Southwest Africa, as Namibia was known under South African sovereignty, had previously been a German colony. The South African Defense Force was ill-prepared for the war they were to fight for the next 23 years. The South African Army was still armed with World War II-era weapons, and many senior officers and NCOs were World War II veterans. South Africa's Air Force was likewise unprepared for war, having already been equipped with outdated French aircraft and World War II-era transport planes like the DC-3 Dakota. International sanctions made it more difficult for the South Africans to obtain spare parts for their weapons. But the South African Border War was more than just a war between South Africa and SWAPO. The Cold War was in full swing, and Pretoria saw the war against SWAPO as an extension of the West's war against communism. Indeed, SWAPO was receiving assistance from the Eastern Bloc. Of course, there was a racial dimension to this too, as the racist policy of apartheid was entrenched in South African society. In fact, South Africa's white minority government used the threat of communism as a justification for racially oppressive laws. Racial discrimination and heavy-handed repression by the apartheid state undoubtedly worsened black discontent. According to author Leopold Schultz, the first years of the border war were very low-key. After having been decimated at Ongulumbashe in 1966, SWAPO did not enter Ovamboland again for some years. After Angola gained its independence in 1975, the country descended into civil war between the FNLA, UNITA, and the MPLA. The MPLA controlled the Angolan government. Meanwhile, the FNLA was knocked out of the civil war early on, and its cadres would go on to form the elite 3-2 Battalion of the South African Army. 3-2 Battalion carried out a number of cross-border operations in Angola, becoming the most decorated unit in South African military history. UNITA, under Jonas Savimbi, would continue to be a thorn in the side of the MPLA until Savimbi's death in 2002. South Africa no longer had friendly Portuguese colonies on their borders, and her northern neighbor Rhodesia was in no place to render meaningful assistance. Allow me to talk a little bit about the Alcora exercise. The Alcora exercise was a covert alliance between South Africa, Rhodesia, and Portugal that was established in 1970. At first, they shared intelligence but cooperated on issues like counterinsurgency too. By 1973, Portugal was losing its colonial wars in Africa, and the Carnation Revolution in 1974 scuttled the Alcora exercise and its future plans. In late 1975, the SADF launched Operation Savannah. The South Africans were initially conducting operations against SWAPO in Angola, but in a case of mission creep, the SADF would come to the aid of Savimbi's UNITA. Author Leopold Schultz says, "In fact, the South African objectives were rather modest. In a first operational instruction emanating from the chief of the SADF, the army was tasked only to help UNITA win back the territories it had previously controlled. In just over a month of fighting, the South Africans advanced more than 3,000 kilometers and won all 30 engagements they fought in, at a cost of 5 dead and 41 wounded. While the SADF may have won in the field, they were about to lose the political war big time. In response to the South African incursion, which Pretoria tried to keep on the low, Cuba sent a large expeditionary force to Angola to aid the MPLA. The Cuban campaign in Angola has been compared to the American campaign in Vietnam. Soviet advisors were present in Angola as well. On the field, the SADF had beaten the Cuban forces in battle. However, as South African troops were approaching Luanda, Angola's capital, they were forced to withdraw due to international pressure. South Africa's white population was subjected to conscription, just like in Rhodesia. In 1978, national service in South Africa was extended from a year to 2 years. Although apartheid was Pretoria's official policy, there were racially integrated SADF units, such as 3-2 Battalion. Pretoria entered the war with disadvantages. One of these disadvantages was a lack of suitable armored vehicles, primarily tanks. In numerous engagements, the SADF would engage enemy tanks with armored cars not suited for war in the bush. Tanks like the Oliphant were not introduced until the latter part of the war, and even then they were fielded in very limited numbers. As mentioned previously, South African equipment during the border war was quite dated, especially planes and helicopters. Once again, sanctions made it harder to procure spare parts. On an individual basis, the SADF was made up of comparatively competent personnel. In 1988, the South African Air Force was reportedly voted as the best in the world at the time, with Britain's RAF and the Israeli Air Force tied for second place. It is also worth noting that the SAAF and the Israeli Air Force exchanged pilots. In addition to the dual heritage of the British Army and the Boer Commandos, there was Israeli influence in the SADF's operations and doctrine. SADF personnel were trained in Israeli schools as well. On the opposing side, the Cubans and the MPLA were deeply influenced by Soviet military doctrine. The casus belli for the South African border war was attacks by SWAPO, but the South Africans launched operations deep into Angola frequently to aid the UNITA forces. As a result, South African troops would also engage FAPLA, as the Angolan military was known at the time. It was during an engagement with the FAPLA brigade that 3-2 Battalion suffered its largest single loss of life in May 1980. The SADF tried to minimize its contact with FAPLA and at times were only permitted to engage them in self-defense. The Battle of Cuito Cuanavale toward the end of the war, involving the South Africans against FAPLA and Cuban forces, was the largest conventional land battle in Africa since the Second World War. So how did the South African border war end? Well, to paraphrase Leopold Schultz, every side came out a winner. South Africa prevented SWAPO from taking control of Southwest Africa by force and installing a one-party dictatorship. SWAPO was forced to contest a free and fair election in 1989, which they ended up winning. Namibia was granted independence in 1990 and is a multi-party democracy today. For South Africa, the SADF bought the apartheid regime time to negotiate a political settlement to the end of apartheid. Cuba, for its part, was able to withdraw from Angola and save face. Approximately 2,500 South Africans lost their lives in the border war. Roughly 2,000 Cubans fell in the border war along with over 10,000 SWAPO insurgents. Apartheid in South Africa ended in earnest in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela, the country's first black leader. Why did white rule in South Africa last so long? The major reason is that white South Africans made up a much larger share of the population, once comprising under a fifth of the total population. In addition, South Africa was richer and more powerful than the Portuguese holdings in Africa and Rhodesia. The white minority regimes in southern Africa were the last dominoes blown over by the winds of change. Predictably, these governments would not go quietly or without a fight, and fight they did. The countries that once made up part of the European empires in the region all pursued differing paths politically and developmentally. The legacy of European colonial rule in these countries and in Africa more broadly can never be erased from their stories. What do you guys think? Are there any other regions of the world with a similar story to Southern Africa? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.